go deeper this month. So let's begin. Welcome, everybody. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center, and I'm so excited to have you all here today so we can fly through American history and look at all the times we have changed the Constitution. 27 times. We put these into big groupings today so we can understand and go through those. And for today's class, I'm with one of our top scholars, Nick Mosvick. Nick, you want to say hi to everybody?
Hi.
Nick is, I know he doesn't sound like it, but he's really excited to go through this class. We have so many things to go over, but big questions that we're going to solve today is how do the constitutional amendments transform and change the Constitution and our way of life under the government here? Which constitutional rights and principles have the American people added into the Constitution through Article 5, which is in the structural constitution of how we change it, and what changes were made to the structural constitution and how they affect us in our life. So Nick, do you want to start off with how do we actually amend the Constitution, and then we'll start diving into the Bill of Rights?
Yeah, that's just a quick reminder of something we've had our prior class on Article 5, but that's just the amendment process. And I think the slide is actually a pretty helpful breakdown of that, because that's really essentially all that's in Article 5. Is there two ways that you can amend the Constitution? One way is for Congress to do so. So an amendment would be proposed. Typically, there's a committee. We always like to mention that. There's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of rewriting that goes on, usually before these things are finally voted on. But it requires 2/3 of the members of both houses of Congress in order to approve an amendment and then send it to the states, right? So Congress, in that first column, you need 2/3 of the members, then you got to send it to the states, and 3/4 of the states need to ratify it. The other method is for 2/3 of the states to call for a constitutional convention, but that's never happened before. That's not to say it couldn't happen, just to say that in history, that's not happened. There's never been a second convention, even though there have been many calls for one. So the way that amendments have happened is that Congress itself has proposed them and then sent them to the states.
Awesome. So big picture overview. We did dive deep in Article 5 a few weeks ago, so we'll send you all the link to that video too. So if you want to learn more of how it works, just in case you have a 28th Amendment you want to add, it's a tutorial on how to get your 28th in. So I love this kind of big idea for the class, that we think about the Constitution as our charter of freedom, but that the founding generation, the writers of the Constitution, knew that there would always be a way for the future generations to add to it. I like to say to edit it or to improve it. And that's the amendment process. And we've done that 27 times. Now, Nick, can you kind of walk us through the groupings around these amendments so we understand how to package them?
Yeah, so we have a basic breakdown here, and part of this is to say there are long periods in American history in which there aren't really amendments that are passed. So there isn't a lot of significant change. So it's worth doing this chronologically in order to highlight the periods in which there are major shifts, right? Because what you'll notice as we talk is there will be these pockets of American history, and then which is a flourish of amendments. And then a lot of these other periods in which there's just not a lot of change. And so the founding period is obviously focused on the Bill of Rights, although that's not the only change. Reconstruction brings us 3 major amendments. The Progressive Era brings us several more significant changes, including arguably structural changes. And then the Modern Era is just kind of a way of pegging a larger grouping of changes, although it's worth noting again, most of those happen over the 1960s. A lot of those happen in the 1960s up to, I think, 1971 is when the 26th Amendment is ratified. So most of those actually happened a long time ago. So that's a reminder that 1992, we had one, but that actually, we might say it was 203 years old at that point. So
yeah, and we'll get into that one. I love, we were joking when our team was writing this image, is they were like kind of modern, because nobody thinks 1933 that modern. Riley's favorite is the 13th Amendment, good choice. Schock's favorite is the 14th Amendment. So let's go through. Milo loves the Second Amendment. So let's go through and look at the amendments. And then gang, just write down for yourself, if you don't want to share it, what's your favorite amendment right now? Then we're going to go to the end of the class, and then you're going to tell us if it's still your favorite amendment. Lauren, I'm with you. First Amendment. So let's go there with the First Amendment and Lauren's favorite founding period. It gave us 12 amendments, including the Bill of Rights. And we look at these big ideas on these amendments. Do you want to walk us through this? And then we can fly through at least the first 10.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's worth taking them all as a group. And frankly, the 11th and 12th, we might as well take them up as a period, because again, this is, as Kerry put it, it's editing, right? So which is to say the Constitution is passed, but it's also quickly altered because of what is thought to be missing, right? And the Bill of Rights, as we often talk about, is the result of largely anti-federalists complaining of a lack of a Bill of Rights starting in the Constitutional Convention, and forcing James Madison and other Federalist hands to offer a Bill of Rights in the first Congress. So we don't have to get into that specific story, but that's why to say, look, hey, look, there's immediate change in editing in the first Congress. So the First Amendment, which of course we've, this last month, we've gone through all these different parts of this, right? We remind that there's 5 or 6 rights within that First Amendment. It's a bundle of its own rights: religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. And remember, there's 2 clauses for religious freedom, and these rights connect broadly to our freedom of conscience. The religious rights are the right to the free exercise of religion, and then the prohibition against the establishment of religion, or the Establishment Clause. The speech and press clause, those protect both the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. And at this point, I think arguably we say that the Supreme Court protects free speech rights more strongly than any time in our history. And generally speaking, the government may not jail, fine, or punish people or organizations based on what they say or write. And speech is protected unless it is likely to cause and directed to cause immediate violence. In other words, if it's intended to do so. There is, of course, other contexts we talk about in our own First Amendment classes, like the schoolhouse, where this is different. And then finally, there's assembly and petition, which I think when we talked about, we wanted to make a highlight how this shows the First Amendment is also constructed on the backdrop of protecting minority views, which is to say that because we do not know which views are right at any given time, and the government does not know which views are right, and we cannot control your conscience and your thoughts. Therefore, we must protect the views that are not in the majority at all times, because they may, over the course of history, turn out to be right, which is the lesson of the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, for instance, that so openly used assembly and petition is one of the vehicles for fighting for progress. So that's the First Amendment. The Second Amendment is we show here, right? We can kind of group these together. The military amendments is one way to think about it. I think Akil Amar, I know Tom and Wednesday will talk about Akil. I'll let him give him a little bit more praise. But I think Akil is helpful here. He's a professor at Yale and a friend of the center. And he would point out that federalism is what highlights these amendments. They're not the only ones. We'll get to the 9th and 10th as well. But that's to say that it's part of a structural protection of state power and not just about individual rights. And so that's a way of understanding from the viewpoint of 1789 what they were trying to do. And that's why the Second Amendment, for instance, has 2 clauses in it, right? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So there's 2 things going on here, right? There's the individual right we highlight today, starting with Heller versus District of Columbia, which protects the right to own a handgun in one's home. And then there's that first clause, which generally says a little bit more about this idea of federalism, right? The notion that the state militia itself, that power to have its own military force, is protected against the interference of the federal government. The Third Amendment, how is that likewise? Well, remember, the Bill of Rights originally only applies to the federal government. So this is the sense that the federal government can't have a standing army. That the Second Amendment says that's true, but the Third Amendment says that's true. Why is that so? Because it comes out of the experience of British soldiers under the Quartering Act, supposedly breaking in and forcing themselves to stay in people's homes. And that's what a standing professional army does in peacetime. And that was considered to be a major threat to liberty and part of tyranny to the founding generation. Therefore, they put the Third Amendment, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in a home, into the Bill of Rights. Takes us to the Fourth Amendment, which we start, as we say, privacy and property rights. I think the Fourth Amendment, it's okay to treat on its own, because there's, like the First Amendment, there's a whole grouping of rights in here. I know we talked about this when we did civil liberties. We talked about this when we did Bill of Rights. We'll talk about it again when we do the Fourth Amendment itself. But there are several components in here. The big part is the general warrants we talk about, which is, what is the founding generation? What are they really trying to prevent? What is James Madison, the drafter of the Bill of Rights, trying to do? It's general warrants, which is an experience out of the 1760s and 1770s under the British government. All it really means is a general warrant is you go into someone's home, you search someone's ship, someone's place. You don't say what you're looking for. You can look for anything. You can search for anything, right? So there's no specificity. And that was thought to be deeply illiberal and violation of fundamental liberty. Therefore, in the text of the Fourth Amendment, not only does it talk about what is protected, right? Persons, houses, papers, and effects against what? Unreasonable searches and seizures. But there's a warrant requirement, right? A warrant has to show probable cause, right? In other words, a good reason to search, and it has to be supported by oath or affirmation. You have to particularly describe the place to be searched and or the persons or things to be seized, right? In other words, it has to be particular. And so the very text embodies that fear that they had. There cannot be general warrants. A warrant must be specific, right? You must have probable cause. All those things are packed into the Fourth Amendment. So that's the Fourth Amendment. We can take us to the Fifth. Keep this energy up. I know we talked about this last time with civil liberties. Again, this is a huge package of rights here going on in the Fifth Amendment, right? We have the rights of criminal defendants, and we have property rights in here. What are the two things going on here? Well, we don't have time to go into what the grand jury clause is, or the self-incrimination clause, although it's very important. We talked about the Miranda warnings last time. This idea that you have the right to remain silent being one of these fundamental liberties of criminal defendants. That's the right against self-incrimination that's within the Fifth Amendment. There's also the double jeopardy clause. And then there's the property clauses. So there's the due process of law, right? You cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That's a key fundamental protection that goes back to the Magna Carta. And then private property cannot be taken for public use without just compensation. That is the takings clause. So when you think of what we call eminent domain today, right, the notion of the government, be it the state, local, or federal, taking property for a public use, that is an articulation of this Fifth Amendment principle, which says that there must be a public use and there must be just compensation if the government does so. So that's a protection of fundamental property rights. That's the Fifth Amendment.
Yeah, I love the idea of pleading the Fifth. That's how we all kind of remember it. Now, Fifth overlaps.
That's the right to remain silent. Yes. Yeah. Plead the Fifth. What you're saying is, I will not get on the stand and incriminate myself, and that's your right to do so. As I won't talk. That's what you're saying, right? When you plead the Fifth.
You're allowed to be silent.
Yes.
Yeah. The
you're
right
saying,
to be
I'm
silent.
not going to talk.
Yeah. So the Fifth overlaps with this next kind of grouping. So
yes,
with
and I think that's fair to put them all together.
Yeah, I love them together. So look at
process. Process protections, right, for the rights of the accused, is Kerry has put this, right? And a lot of these is I suggested with due process, the confrontation clause, they're older, right? They've been around for a long time. So they're considered fundamental liberties that have a basis in English history. The Sixth Amendment, as we talked about in civil liberties, that protects everything down to the right to remain counsel, the right to an impartial jury, the right to a speedy and public trial, the right to confront witnesses against you. That's called the confrontation clause, which essentially means in most purposes, if there's a witness against you, that you can put them on the stand and cross-examine them. And you have a right to compulsory process to have your own witnesses in your favor, right? Those are all things packaged together in the Sixth Amendment. Those are considered to be basic procedural rights of criminal defendants. The Seventh Amendment is about civil process. That was largely put in there because a lot of anti-federalists and others complained that while the Constitution itself in Article 3 protected the right to a jury trial, and the right to a trial by jury was considered one of the most fundamental rights. So the fact that it was mentioned for criminal trials, that upset people. They said, well, okay, but if you say that, then you imply there's no such protection for criminal or civil trials. That can't be the case. You must have the right to a jury trial in all cases, right? Because it's so fundamental to be tried by your peers and not merely by a judge, right? And so you think about that in terms of the power of the community, the power of the people. We like to connect these things sometimes to popular sovereignty. I think that's the right way to think about it, is that, yes, the people themselves have a check on power. One of those is by being a jury. And therefore, you must have the right to trial by jury by the peers of your community, whether you're a criminal defendant or in a civil trial. The Eighth Amendment, this is another one of these basic criminal protections that also goes back to the English Bill of Rights of 1689. Two components there, right? There's the excessive bail clause that shall not be required, or excessive fines imposed. So bail and fines, two parts of that, nor cruel or unusual punishments inflicted, right? What that means, that takes a lot of time to get into. In fact, we could have our own Eighth Amendment class to get in the particulars of what that has meant over time. That's a complicated set of history, but needless to say is that they could directly go back to 1689 and then the Virginia Declaration of Rights for this exact language. So it was well known in terms of a basic protection for criminal defendants. The Ninth and 10th Amendments, as I mentioned with the second and third, can also be grouped under this notion of federalism, but also popular sovereignty. Another one of our friends of the center who also was on recently, that's Kurt Lash. We're taking from his theory, and what Professor Lash essentially says is the idea here was to protect we the people most fundamentally, which is to say, it's not just about the division of power between the state and federal government that's going on here when we're protecting unenumerated rights and then the powers of the states that are not given to the federal government, but it's that the people themselves only ever gave power to the federal government under the Constitution, limited enumerated powers when they agreed to that Constitution, because power flows from the people themselves, right? In other words, what I'm saying, right, is the very idea of popular sovereignty, if taken seriously, means that any of the rights they did not willingly give away under that Constitution that they ratified, they must maintain rights in power. So you read the Ninth Amendment, what does it say? The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights, in other words, those in the Bill of Rights, should not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people, right? By the people. So that it's highlighting that phrase. I'll note that other scholars will look at that and see a natural rights reading, that this is about unenumerated rights. So that could be the Ninth Amendment. But again, this is what we take from Professor Lash. He says the same thing in the 10th Amendment, right? Read that text again. The power is not delegated to the people or to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, right? So yes, the states have reserved powers that they did not give away under the Constitution. But that phrasing, or to the people, is to suggest that, again, the people themselves ultimately retain power and authority. And federalism itself was really about popular sovereignty, because it was to say the people are represented most closely by their state governments. And therefore, it's fundamental that those states retain certain powers and abilities to protect the rights of people. Therefore, that's why the Ninth and 10th Amendment were written the way that they are. I hope that makes sense, the way that I'm describing it.
Totally. Okay, we're going to fly through 11th and 12th. And as
we can fly through those, because the 11th Amendment is complicated. We don't really need to talk about Chisholm versus State of Georgia. It is maybe the first important Supreme Court case in 1793. All this is really just about state sovereignty and sovereign immunity, which is to say whether or not states can be sued in certain situations, right? This is what this is really about, right? Is when can states themselves be sued, and when are they protected from suits? And states essentially wanted greater protection from suits Therefore, we had an 11th Amendment. I think that's the best way to say it without getting too deeply into what can be very murky waters. The 12th Amendment, we talk about this in many classes. This is really about the election of 1800, the lessons of the election of 1800 in the election of 1796, which is to say, if there is an edit that needed to be made right away, it was to the system of choosing the presidency. Two immediate problems came up. In 1796, it was the problem of, oh no, the president and vice president will be the rivals. The people who go against each other in the election will now have to work together in government. That's a bad idea. The election of 1800 is, what happens if the president and vice president is candidates tie, and it has to go to Congress? They have to pick who will be the president, because the ballot system is weird and doesn't allow you to separately pick for the president and vice president. Then Aaron Burr stays in the ballot, tries to be president himself. You have 36 ballots before Congress finally chooses Thomas Jefferson. And then everyone realizes we need an amendment to at least say there will be separate ballots in the Electoral College picking the president and vice president. We cannot have a crisis again the way we did in 1800, because that had potential for a civil war. That takes us to Reconstruction.
And then we have a civil war, and we've got bang, 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 3 amendments really quickly. 13th, 14th, and 15th, kind of wrap it together. And as we look at these future amendments, Riley asked a great question earlier. Are there any amendments that take away parts of the structural constitution? So I just want to put that in your head as you look at them, just to be like, oh, that kind of takes it away, or it edits it in some way.
Yes.
So Reconstruction amendments, 13th ends slavery, 14th adds equality, the Declaration of Promise of Declaration into the Constitution, and 15th adds voting rights for African-American males. But real quick, walk us through these 3 real quick. We're running out of time. Let's go.
Yeah. Well, and we should say that to that question, arguably, that is the really big question at the heart of these 3 amendments is, to what degree do they change federalism? By removing powers of the state governments, but also empowering the federal governments over the state governments, right? In other words, altering the fundamental balance between the 2 sovereignties. That is a key part of this transformation, just to get to those structural changes. The 13th Amendment, which is passed in Congress January 31st, 1865, and then ratified December 6, 1865, after the end of the Civil War, ends slavery and involuntary servitude, although it's noted in that text, except for is a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. In other words, penal is part of penal work. It should be noted that there were texts that were offered in 1864 that wouldn't have included this, but this was actually language taken from the Northwest Ordinance written by Thomas Jefferson in 1787 that banned slavery in the territories. So instead of other language, they ended up copying this old language and putting it forward. But then there's section 2, which we'll notice in all 3 of these amendments, that it gives Congress power to enforce this article. That was important even in the 13th Amendment, because the Civil Rights Act of 1866 passed before the 14th Amendment. The Republicans in Congress said it came from 13th Amendment, section 2. They said we have authority to ensure that these badges and incidents of slavery, as they said, could not continue. They said the black codes essentially were a way of manifesting a form of slavery in a different name, right?
And it absolutely was.
Yes.
So that moves, then they decide to add even more to the Constitution and add 14th Amendment. And
they need to make the change permanent. That's the big way we put it, right? Is that, okay, we have a Civil Rights Act, we have a Freeman's Bureau, we have all these other things we're doing, but we need a permanent change, because that allows for these newly freed people to use the Constitution as the basis for their claims to equality, right? You can see why that's a difference. That's what we're talking about, structural change, right? And the 14th Amendment, section 1 in particular, gives those new claims, right? Citizenship for all, right? Which ends Dred Scott's rule, right? All those born or naturalized in the United States, subject to the jurisdiction of, are citizens of the United States, right? That's birthright citizenship. And then we have the Privileges or Immunities Clause, the Due Process Clause now apply to the states. Yes, we have that in the 5th Amendment. We could talk about if there's any difference. Suffice to say, not really. This is about applying it to the states. That's the kind of the more fundamental change here. equal protection of the laws, right? Thought these things, the framers thought all these things together would apply the Bill of Rights to the states, enforce basic rights, right? Not just the Bill of Rights, but some sort of a set of basic rights and liberties against state interference, right? Through these three things. And then, of course, there's the power to enforce, which again, Congress would do, at least in this period. If you look at the enforcement acts, the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 and the Civil Rights Act of 1875, they did use that power. And the 15th Amendment had that same. Again, like the 13th Amendment, there were drafts that had more universal language that specifically would have tried to deal with the problem of poll taxes and other artifices used by states in order to bring down the black vote, or to even apply it to women. There were drafts that applied this to women as well. So women in, again, more universal language, but ultimately they ran out of time because that's how these things work. And so they settled on more basic language. And the reason I note that is it's negative in the sense that it doesn't guarantee a right to vote, but what that language does is says it cannot be denied or abridged by any state or the United States, right? On account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, right? So you can't deny the vote on the basis of that.
But it doesn't promise a vote either.
It doesn't, which means that there are different ways you can deny the vote, is what it ultimately suggests. So it's not universal in that it does not more broadly protect that right to vote. And we'll see that language pop up again in roughly 50 years. Which takes us to the progressive era.
Progressive era. Okay,
Yes.
So let's do six. We're gonna fly through these because we're getting to all the amendments in the next 5 minutes. 16th Amendment.
Yes.
What's the big idea?
Big idea is overruling the Supreme Court, which is kind of like a repeat of Chisholm versus Georgia from along the 11th Amendment, which is, say, the Supreme Court in 1895 said that the federal government had no power to lay an income tax nationally. And so the 16th Amendment was simply changing that and granting an additional power of Congress to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived. So that changed that. 17th Amendment reflected an existing movement. We'll talk about this when we get to the 19th Amendment too, which say a lot of states had already changed the way they had done things before the 17th Amendment, but this had to do with direct election of senators. So recall in the original Constitution, so speaking of structural change, originally senators were chosen by the state legislators. This was thought to be part of the system of federalism because it allowed the states themselves to have the power and to better reflect both the people themselves, but also the states is their own entity and their own sovereignty represented by the national government.
And that blows my mind. That's the 17th Amendment.
Yes. So
18th Amendment.
So this is prohibition because we'll get to the 21st Amendment too, which simply more or less reverses it, right? Which is to say that the 18th Amendment is what brought us into national prohibition of alcohol for a period of, 14 years? And this was a movement that went back almost 100 years to the origins of the temperance movement in 1828 to end the sale of intoxicating liquors. And of course, without getting too much in the history, the whole problem with the 18th Amendment is that it brought about other subsequent changes, namely the rise of organized crime, which people felt were a much greater problem than people drinking in and of itself. And therefore, that's eventually how we got the 21st Amendment to change this. The 19th Amendment, I think we have to give a little more time to that. Right. Again, this language is actually lifted from the 15th Amendment, right? It's the same language as the 15th Amendment, except for it refers to sex instead of race. Originally, there were more expansive versions of this, once again, offered in the 1870s. But by 1878, the movement had settled on this language. It would be offered over and over again. A lot of states allowed women to vote by this point. It started in the West in the 19th century, starting with Wyoming, Colorado, and other Western states. So there was a state-by-state movement. But eventually, President Woodrow Wilson was pressured by activists who stood outside the White House and let themselves be arrested, forced into hunger strikes in order to bring about their message and really force Congress to act on the 19th Amendment, which they did in 1918, and then it took 2 years to get ratified. The 20th Amendment, we talk about this when we talk about the presidency, because what this did is it finally set in the Constitution the time for the inauguration and the transfer of power. Formerly, before this, there was a long lame duck period between presidencies because the president wouldn't be inaugurated till typically March 4th. So in between the election and inauguration, there would be 4 months, which is really a long time in between administrations. So this changed that to set permanently January 20th at noon is the transfer of power. The 21st Amendment, we already mentioned, although it's worth noting, it does get rid of prohibition. It also leaves to the states the power to prohibit intoxicating liquors within states, which is, by the way, how you have dry states and dry counties well into the modern period. So the states are actually given back power in some sense by the 21st Amendment. It's always worth noting that
there's still and there's still dry
yes.
cities and dry towns today. And 21st Amendment, the one thing about it is the 18th Amendment stops alcohol. It does actually roll back our drinking problem in America. Like, don't kid ourselves. Right. There was a drinking problem. People were drinking too much. It did stop that, even though it created a lot of lawlessness. Okay, 22nd Amendment. We're flying through now. 22nd.
Yeah, 22nd Amendment. Let's just simply said, FDR broke a long-standing precedent, which was set by George Washington, which is you only serve 2 terms as president. Yes, the text doesn't say there's a limit on terms, but we have an example. We've all followed that. FDR is the only person who said, nah, I'm going to run for a 3rd and a 4th term. Well, the Republican platform starting in 1941, as soon as FDR broke that rule, said, we need an amendment to permanently change this because we never thought anyone would break the rule. So now we're going to change it. The other thing worth noting is that it also, there's a Truman rule in there, which is to say, technically what it says is you can serve up to 10 years as president. If you were vice president and you succeed the president because the president died or for other reasons, if it's under 2 years, then you can run for 2 more terms yourself. But the Truman rule means because FDR died only months into his 4th term, Harry Truman could only run for 1 term himself.
They were saying something.
Called that the Harry Truman rule.
Awesome.
The 23rd Amendment, that gives the District of Columbia, DC, 3 electoral votes. So it did not give it a Senate, 2 Senate seats or congressional representation, but it did give it 3 electoral votes for electing the president in the Electoral College, the president and the vice president, actually to be specific. The 24th Amendment is poll taxes. So this is during the Civil Rights Movement, because even into the 1960s, there were still 5 states that were employing the use of poll taxes up to 1964 when the 24th Amendment was finally ratified, although I believe it was passed by Congress in 1962 and given to the states. So it just took a couple years to ratify. So that ended one of the ways that states had for decades and decades reduced the black vote. So that's, and Kerry just pointed out to you, by the way, there's enforcement power. That's not always thing there, but it's there. The 25th Amendment, this is a very complicated text. The best way to put this is President Truman, there he is again. He was pushing for this himself when he was president in 1948, 1950. You can look back, you can find speeches where he's saying, we desperately need an amendment to deal with this problem of presidential secession. The problem of presidential secession went back to 1841 when William Henry Harrison died and John Tyler took over, and the Whigs were mad because he wasn't really one of them. And they said, well, you're vice president. You don't really get the president's powers. You're just the vice president acting as president. He said, no, I take the oath, I get the powers. He set an informal precedent going forward, but there wasn't really a formal line of secession the way we have now. And so in the 20th century, we had all these problems of presidents dying or being incapacitated. Woodrow Wilson had a stroke. He was out of commission for a year. FDR had numerous health problems before he died. Eisenhower had multiple heart attacks, and he had to famously sign over on a piece of paper the powers of the presidency temporarily to Vice President Richard Nixon. And all the lesson from this was, well, this is not a way to do this. We need a better line of secession, not just the vice president, but what happens if the vice president dies? What if the vice president needs to be replaced? They set that up in the 25th Amendment too. So it was just all these, it was an edit again, as Curry puts it. This was more of an edit of, there's just some missing details we didn't get to when we wrote this because we weren't thinking about those specific problems. We were thinking about the larger questions of the structure of the presidency, not some of these finer points that only experience could tell us, right? And that's kind of more the edit than the structural change, if that makes sense. I think that's what we're hitting at, right? Is some things are just edits. The 26
addendums. I always think about it.
Like addendums, that. Right? It's like,
look,
we've had enough experience. Informal changes sometimes work, but look, it's been over 100 years. Let's just have an amendment. Let's formalize this. It's better for everybody if we do that. The 26th Amendment, that's also the same language as the 19th and 15th. You'll see it again. The only difference is, okay, we did race, we had sex, now we have age, right? I have to say this because it's important, because we usually think of this as giving 18-year-olds the right to vote. What it specifically says beyond that, though, is that the vote cannot be denied or abridged on account of age, right? So you can't have age discrimination in voting. So yes, it gives 18-year-olds the right to vote, but more specifically, the language does so by saying there can't be age discrimination. I mentioned this because there were suits even this last year about certain states' systems of mail-in voting as being a form of age discrimination because of who it potentially privileged in the vote.
Yeah. Okay. 27th Amendment, the last one.
And that's the finally one, right? Let's talk about the project of a college student in the 1980s who found one of the two amendments as part of the 12 amendments of the original Bill of Rights package sent to the states in 1789. Two of them didn't get passed. One of them still hasn't gotten passed, and that has to do with changing the formula for the House of Representatives, which, if passed now, would mean there would be thousands of members of the House. So it would be a huge change. The other one had to do with increasing salaries, the House's ability to essentially pay itself more, or for Congress to do so. And a college student found this in 1982 and famously got a C paper when he wrote up this amendment that had never been formally ratified, but had been very close to being so as part of the original Bill of Rights. A member of Congress really liked this idea, and then they kind of worked together in the 1980s to bring about this campaign. And then finally in 1992, 203 years later, it was finally ratified as part of the Constitution. So that takes us to, I know, Curry, you wanted to get to your last thing. What will you propose to allow you to do that?
So always remember, students, if you get a C, don't worry. You can be the smartest one in the amendment process. So don't worry.
Well, the teacher did, like 30 years later, say I was wrong. To be clear, right? I mean,
awesome.
I think NPR caught up with her, and she was like, "He should have gotten an A. I'm sorry." So there we go.
So flash forward through all those amazing amendments. We are a little over time, and I apologize, but I want you all to walk away with this thought. What would your 28th Amendment be? I love the idea of the voting rights amendments have the same language, and would there be another group that would be in that language to be added to? I know we talked about the Equal Rights Amendment. We talk about the Electoral College being changed. All those things have popped up in the last year of our classes, but I kind of want to leave it to you guys. What would you propose as the 28th Amendment, knowing the process and knowing all the other ones that we've done over time? Not too many, but still kind of in groupings of big change. And think about, what would you add to the Constitution? Send it to us in an email or shoot it to us the next time you're in class. We'd love to hear it. We love to collect those ideas and put them out there for everybody to see what our students across America are thinking as well. So thank you so much, Nick. You did a great job. That was really fast. Students, thank you so much. I hope it wasn't too overwhelming. You walked away with the big ideas, and what a fun class. See you all next time in class. We'll be here for questions if you need them after class.